So after watching NLE on the Den of Kings podcast, I saw a comment where someone was basically saying that they wanted NLE to do an interview or a collab with Jason Wilson. And so I don't really know who Jason Wilson is, but I did want to actually look into that and see what this Jason Wilson guy was all about. And so I came across two interviews, one with B. Simone and the other with Cam Newton. And so I started to watch B. Simone, but that one didn't appeal to me at that moment. And so I went with the Cam Newton one. I may go back to B. Simone just because that one is for women. And I do want to hear what he has to say to women. Now, let's talk about Cam Newton. So, I was not a fan of this interview for mainly one reason. He just came across as very immature, and there are a lot of different things that contributed to me feeling that way. However, I do think you should do interviews with people you don't agree with or people who challenge you, because then you're not just doing interviews with people who agree with you or people who just come on to flatter you and not really challenge you and all of that stuff. But this definitely was a frustrating interview to watch just because of Cam Newton and how he was responding, how he approached the whole conversation. And so it just seemed like either he didn't know what Jason Wilson was all about, or he was expecting to maybe convince or change Jason Wilson's opinion. I'm not 100% sure what the purpose of this interview was, so I am curious to know what you guys think about that. The main impression that I got of Cam Newton was that he's basically using the Bible to justify why he's not making good decisions, and I don't want it to seem like I'm judging him for not being a good Christian, because that's definitely not what I'm doing, but I think it's him making bad choices as a person. He's just using the Bible to say, hey, look, other people make bad decisions too, or I don't have to try to be perfect. I'm not perfect because we're all sinners, that sort of thing. And I don't really like that, because I think it's just him making excuses for why he can't try to be a better person and ultimately a better man. This is heyybritny. Welcome back. Okay, so first up, I want to compare Cam Newton to NLE, since this was what brought me to this particular interview between Cam Newton and Jason Wilson. And so the first thing that I'll say is that I did say in my last video that NLE was super annoying. Cam was also annoying in this interview with Jason Wilson, but it was for very different reasons. NLE was annoying because he kept interjecting and sharing his opinion, but he was really doing it from like a positive light and showing what he learned or how he overcame a situation, whereas Cam Newton was being annoying because he had an excuse for why he couldn't do better, why he was making certain decisions, that sort of thing. And so it's two different dynamics, but both people were annoying, but I would obviously prefer NLE's approach in the way that he handled the conversation versus how Cam Newton handled the conversation. Now, granted, NLE didn't talk about relationships or just being a man in the way that Cam Newton did. In that sense, it's not a fair comparison because they talked about two completely different topics. However, it was their approach to those conversations which is what is important to me, and I would prefer how NLE handled the conversation. And what really frustrated me about Cam Newton is that he really seemed at times like he thought he was being really deep and really insightful, but he was just trying to be cute, and it was not coming off the way that he thought it was, because he was really immature from the way that he was sitting and all of that stuff. And it was just really crazy to watch him throughout this interview doing the antics that he was doing. And then he thought he was raising good points, or he was making Jason have to sit back and think about things in a way that would make Jason think differently. But Jason was like, no, what do you mean? Or you have that wrong. And then Jason would kind of preach to him or try to educate him on where he was wrong. And you could just see Cam Newton staring at him like, and at times, I could not tell if he was just blacked out and not paying attention, but it didn't seem like he was very engaged in the conversation when he was hearing things that he didn't want to hear. So really, what his comments throughout this interview showed was that he was unwilling to grow as a person, as a man. It seemed like he really just wanted to have an excuse for why he didn't have to do better or why he shouldn't have to do better. Like, what you get is what you see, and I'm not going to change because I'm scared of X, Y, and Z things happening. If we're being honest, from what we saw in this interview, Cam Newton is not an ideal husband or man for a woman. So this is super interesting with how he's talking about marriage and how he's framing it as if he's scared to be married. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of women want to marry him, but when you think about what he brings to the table in terms of being a husband and in terms of being a person, not his fame, not his celebrity, not what he does on the football field, but who he is inside as a person, is that someone that you want to be married to? And in this interview, he does not display that because he talks about temptation that he faces, and then he also talks about why he doesn't want to be married. He's scared of being divorced and losing his money, basically. So he's more fearful of losing his money than he is of creating broken homes. And interestingly, he seems confused on the fact that women are throwing themselves at him, and he seems to think that this is a sign of his value or his worth. And what he doesn't realize is that low value women are throwing themselves at him, so that does not in turn mean that he has more value. Especially if you give into that, that just shows that you're weak and you're not literally able to resist temptation, and you don't get a award for having the most temptation if you can't resist it. Like, you should be able to make a decision, commit to that decision, and not cheat, not do all of this crazy stuff just because you don't want to be married. And so there's a comparison that he brings up later on that I'm going to bring up that kind of turns everything on its head and really exposes kind of what he's doing and how he's operating in this interview. So to reiterate, Cam Newton, in my opinion, is not married because he's fearful of losing his money. He's not married because he's not husband material. Okay, so let's get into the vibes of this interview. So as I mentioned already, Cam didn't really seem like he was there for large parts of the interview, especially when Jason was talking and saying something that he didn't want to hear. You could just see that he was like pouting and unhappy with what Jason was saying, and it was really funny just to see that. It was also kind of rude and disrespectful because you obviously brought this man onto your platform, you wanted to talk to him, and then you don't really want to hear what he had to say, especially when it's not necessarily in criticism of you, but it's pointing out areas where you could do better. And I thought it was really funny because while his body language was weird, he started out the beginning of the interview with an iPad, which was basically his notes and how he was going to move through the conversation. And there was one point they were talking about something, I don't recall what it was, but Cam was like, "Oh, do you mind if we get deep for a second?" And the guy was like, "You tell me, you're the one with the iPad, I don't have any notes," right? And so what he's saying is that Jason is letting the conversation take him where it goes. He's not trying to force anything. He's just really reacting to everything in the moment that Cam said. Whereas Cam, he is acting like he is the only reason why this conversation is getting really deep. And yes, they did talk about some deep topics, but I think that Cam brought those deep topics up as a way to kind of point the finger and say, "Hey, see, this is why I can't do better. This is why I'm right in feeling like I am doing the best that I can given my circumstances, given my situation." And he's not really open to seeing what Jason has to say as far as how he can do better as a man and as a person. On top of that, he was just making smart comments throughout the interview, and it was like he was trying to catch Jason in gotcha moments, and those did not turn out the way that he thought they would because literally Jason pushed back on everything and made him clarify, made him explain everything, and that was really good because then you really got to see what Cam's logic was, where he was coming from, and that helped me to really just not like anything that Cam was saying in this interview. Okay, moving on, they talked about being a man, and we can go ahead and play this clip.
So I say myself because I had to learn how to be more than just strong, a protector and provider, or what we would call masculine, because my mother had suffered dementia, and she needed someone stronger than providing money, someone who protected her from doctors who pushed pills on her. She needed someone to be understanding and patient and long-suffering.
I want to pause it here because this goes back to something that NLE said in his appearance on Den of Kings, and he was basically talking about how you have to have a combination of masculinity and femininity in its true form, not the fake version. And so here you have Jason talking about that. He's talking about how he has to be masculine, be the protector, the provider, but then he also has to be soft with his mother and care for her while she's dealing with a health issue. And that's definitely tough to balance because when you are typically, as a young Black man, you're typically raised to be strong, you can't cry and all of that stuff, and so you, in that sense, when you're raised that way, you don't know how to be soft, you don't know how to care for women in these situations, and so this is hitting on a lot of different topics I've come across in a lot of the different videos I've been watching.
When she would have these mental episodes where she would curse me out, saying, I would never treat you like this, talking to me like she didn't even raise me. And still I had to have the capacity or the self-control to massage her scalp and say, Mama, it's going to be okay. So I learned how to become tender, but also tough, because whenever someone tried to treat her wrong, they saw a different side of me. So I would say I was the first man in my own life to be comprehensive, to be a nurturer, and also a lion as well.
I want to have this.
So I'm not familiar with Jason Wilson's content, and so I've never heard comprehensive man before. So that is something interesting and something new to learn. And basically, from what he just said, it sounds like a combination of being masculine in the traditional sense, but also being a nurturer, because usually you just think of men as being providers. They provide the money, they provide the protection, but they don't have that softer side to where they can relate to you on an emotional level. Because that's why when you have men and women having conversations and the woman is talking about something that is emotional for her, men don't always know how to react because they're not used to dealing with that. And so women will go and talk to their female friends or their women friends about those issues because their partner can't help them deal with that. But when you're married and in a relationship, you do have that bond and that connection just because of the fact that you're married, and your relationship is very different from when you are just boyfriend and girlfriend. And then there's some marriages where they're just marriages of convenience, but there's actual marriages where people really, that's your soulmate, and you do everything for that person, and you connect on many different levels. Next up, I want to move into religion, and so this is going to be interesting. We're going to have Cam Newton talk about his religious background, and then we're going to have Jason talk about where he is with religion.
It's a constant reminder, because I was raised in church, right? Mm-hmm. Father was, still is a pastor, bishop, and Pentecostal, church all day. you know what I'm saying?
Yes,
and I would be open to say this.
I'm going to pause it here. What I find interesting is between this video and the last one with the Den of King, you saw a lot of church people who grew up in the church who are like later in their older years rebelling. And I think that that's a pretty common thing. So it's not specific to these people. And I wonder why that is, because I did not grow up in the church environment where I was there every Sunday, Sunday school, all of that stuff, right? And so I wonder what it is that is making people who grow up in the church kind of rebel and not like that lifestyle? Is it just because you have friends and other people who don't live that lifestyle and you just wish you could be normal? Or is it that there's something that's very unique to the church environment that is turning people off? And they do talk about this later, how there's the difference between church and kind of like the church that's in you, or the Holy Spirit that's in you, because church is what you think of as a building where people go to worship, but you can also be spiritual and study the Bible, read the Bible in your home, in your own environment. So if you don't go to church, that doesn't mean that you're not religious or you're not spiritual. And sometimes going to church can be performative. And so I do find that interesting that you have people who grew up in the church who are rebelling and doing crazy stuff when they've had, I would assume, models of what it means to be a good Christian, what it means to be a good person, and what it means to know right from wrong and to try your best to do the right thing no matter what you're doing.
Even though my religion and Christianity gave me so much of a foundation of what and what not to do, it also handicapped me to being the first figure of judging. You know what I'm saying?
Break that down.
So there's a common phrase in church when I was going to church that's not of God. That ain't of God. Mm-hmm. That ain't. Mm-hmm. And I would always question, but what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And when you talk to churchgoers, it's a holier than thou type of flow. I say all that to say,
I want to pause it here because I think that that's something that I can agree with. Typically, when you have super religious people, they do tend to be very by the book in terms of following the rules, make sure that you're doing the right thing. They really don't tolerate any kind of nonsense, and they can be overly judgmental. And I think that that does turn people off, because if you're a young child, especially, and you have adults around you who act like that, who behave like that, that does kind of make an impression on you and shape how you see the world, especially if you're super young, you're reading the Bible, but you don't know everything, and then you're relying on other people as a young kid, a teenager, that sort of thing. You're relying on other people to tell you what's right and what's wrong and how you should interpret something. I mean, I guess it depends on like how mature you are in terms of your knowledge and what you think about the world, because there are some people who don't really ask questions, or they're not that curious, and they will just believe what the adults around them tell them. And there's other people who will push back, they'll go out and try to find the knowledge for themselves. And so that could be a part of why you have these kids who grew up in the church environment who are rebelling, because really they're rebelling against the adults who basically ran the church, controlled the church, and dictated to them how they should be as believers.
Your practice is Christianity.
No.
What is it?
My practice, when you're talking about the cave of Adullam or who I am as a man,
Yes.
is servanthood. I'm a disciple of Christ. Christianity is a system. I am a Christ follower. You say if I'm a Christian, that literally means you're a Christ follower. I follow Christ, and I'm a servant of the Most High.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you were talking about growing up in church as well,
I want to pause it here because I'm a little bit confused on what this means, because you said Christianity is a system. I get that. I agree with that. Most people think of religion as a organized kind of like institution, where spirituality, that is kind of more like independent, and it's not around going to a building or being around a group of people. It's about you and your connection with a higher being, with God. And so I'm not sure if he's saying, because he said he's not a Christian, but then he said he is a follower of Christ, and then he's also a servanthood, or part of a servanthood. I'm not quite sure what that means, but he is making a distinction between Christianity and whatever it is that he follows, or how he perceived his connection to God.
and people saying that's not of God and this isn't of God. First and foremost, you got to know your word, because people will always say things, and I test it with the scriptures. I always cross-reference what they say with the cross. The scriptures say man's ways and his thoughts is not of the Most High.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always challenge that. People have told me, pastors, not to do the cave of Adullam, to do something else, because I think the Most High could use it that way. I went to his word, and I know I have the same Holy Spirit they say they have, and I followed him, and I'm here today. The biggest issue really isn't, again, I used to overgeneralize like all Christians are this, like I didn't come to church like you did. I hated Christians. I hated the church. I studied Islam, Egyptology, metaphysics, Hinduism, Buddhism. I would wait for the Jehovah's Witnesses to come to my door so that I could argue with them. All right. So just so you know, I wasn't raised in church. The Most High, he called me out of darkness in a way where it's undeniable, where
Okay, so that's the end of the clip. And so he goes on to talk about his journey with spirituality. And he's basically talking about how, I think he was saying that he had a dream or a vision, and it was someone who came to him. And I think he's saying it was Jesus who came to him. And basically, he kind of ignored or resisted what was happening. And then later, he got into basically what I think is a car accident. And then he realized, hey, God, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to do whatever you want me to do. I'm going to serve you. And what was interesting about that is because first he had that vision or that dream, then he had a friend whose mother said, hey, he's going to get in an accident, don't be around him, basically. And so he had all of these signs that were really trying to point him to God and get him to work on his relationship with God, because he talked about how he did not like the church. And then he also talked about the idea of believing in an ever-loving God, but then having to deal with his father not being around, dealing with his brothers being murdered. And so you do have people who, when they're in their lowest moments, they're like, hey, where's God? Why is he letting this happen? And so that also is something that a lot of people struggle with, and it makes you question whether or not God is real. And what that also goes back to is the idea of free will, and how because of what Adam and Eve did in the garden, we are now free to make these choices that wouldn't necessarily reflect what God wants for each and every one of us. And Jason also talked about the idea of having this church building, and obviously if you go to a mega church, you may have a really large church that has a huge campus, and sometimes you can have areas around the church that aren't up to par or doing as well, and so a lot of money goes into upkeeping the church and making it nice and making it a place that people want to go. That's also why people have a negative view of church, because yes, it can be a nice place to gather with people, but if you're not all there for the same reason, you don't all believe in the same thing, and you're not all working towards the same goal of bettering yourselves and doing the best that you can, then it just makes it difficult to go to church, especially with hearing the pastors talk about Charlie Kirk, whether they talked about him at all, or if they did talk about him, what do they say? Do they try to create more divide, or do they try to unify everybody, all of that stuff? And so you can really see why people have doubts about the church environment, especially from when they're coming up when they're younger, and then when you get into these really high tension political situations. And the other important thing that Jason said was that you really need to know the word, you really need to know the Bible, so that when someone tells you something, you can go back and refer to it, and either if you know that part of the Bible really well, you can push back and say, hey, actually no, you're wrong, this is what it says. And so when you don't know what the Bible says, you are more likely to believe what someone else is telling you. There were a few things I just read, and I really liked that because I was able to understand what they were talking about, and then I was also able to draw on my interpretations and my takeaways for those passages that I read. Moving on, they talked about temptation, so I'm just going to go ahead and play a clip of them talking about that.
About my inability to get married or settle down, the things that are kind of brushed away is like, oh, you don't have self-control. Mm-hmm. You don't have discipline. Mm-hmm. But I asked this, and I say it to you also too, Mr. Jason. When you go certain places, like people really wouldn't know who you are, respectfully.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pause it here because basically what they're talking about is not having self-control when it comes to women sleeping around and all of that stuff. And so throughout this interview, they kind of talk about Cam's football career. And obviously, if you are able to be a professional athlete, that means that you do have discipline and you have self-control. You can't get to that level in sports and not have those things. Actually, that is true. You can be super disciplined when it comes to sports, but you can be undisciplined when it comes to your personal life, drinking, drugs, hanging out with women, all of that stuff. So it doesn't go hand in hand that you, just because you are disciplined on the field, on the court, wherever you play your sport, that doesn't always translate into your personal life. And so I thought it was interesting how they talked about how he was good on the field, but obviously that doesn't translate over into his personal life if he's talking about his struggles with women and not being married and all of that stuff.
You're wrong. No, but go ahead.
No, I'm
just messing with you.
I'm trying to make a point.
Yes, sir.
And the point is, when you talk or when there's discussions about how a man can fall victim,
yes,
it's and let me go back because that did not sound right.
No, I appreciate it. I know where you're going.
I'm not talking to you per se, but I'm talking
to the average man, right?
No. These are conversations that I have.
I want to pause it here because you can see how they're not really understanding each other. Like, obviously, I think he did mean to say, nobody knows who you are, nobody recognizes you, I'm more famous than you. I think he meant to say it that way, but then he realized how it sounded, so he tried to take it back. And then they're having this miscommunication over who he's talking to. Like, obviously, he's talking about conversations that he had with his father about this issue, but then he's also trying to take back or walk back what he said and say that he's more so talking about the average person or someone who's not a celebrity who can't understand what it's like to have a bunch of women chasing after you, basically.
With my father.
No. I'm saying listen, brother,
yeah.
I appreciated what you said.
Yeah.
I apologize for interrupting.
Yeah.
I'm saying I understand where you're going, meaning you brothers, the temptation is greater. Am I correct?
No, that is absolutely.
I want to pause it here because you can tell that he's not listening because Jason did get it correct. Jason is saying you face greater temptation, which is what he's trying to say. And then he's like, no. And then that's absolutely correct. So he's just super confused or whatever, and he's not really paying attention and listening to engage with Jason. He's listening to reply.
Okay, great.
But it's one of those things that when I had these discussions with my father, a person who is the most influential person in my life, there's not things where it's like, yeah, but it's always with a but though. And going like,
I don't know if anybody caught like how big of a pun that is, because they're talking about sleeping around and not resisting temptation, but they're literally talking about a butt, a big butt, whatever. I just thought that was funny. There's always a butt there.
this is the topic of Shannon Sharp, right? And I'm not saying what Shannon Sharp was good, bad, or indifferent. What I am saying is I can relate to fallen victim to the lust. And through that, when going back to the discussion of like, hey, when you go places, nobody really would know. But for me, that's a part of my
I want to
lifestyle.
pause it here because, again, they are talking about Shannon Sharp's situation and basically how he, in a sense, he did bring that on himself because he engaged in that activity. He engaged with that person. So yes, you can say it's a bit of a opportunist situation happening there, but he also participated in that situation, which Cam acknowledges. But I think he's also trying to say, well, you know, we're famous, we're going to be tempted, and we're going to fall victim to that, and it's not our fault, basically, is what he is really saying.
Mixing, mingling, networking, being in different places and saying, hey, man, you know, we got to go to dinner. Dinner leads to different opportunities. Hey, let's talk about business. All right, cool. Whether it's on a golf course, whether it's in a conference room, whether it's at a bar, whether it's wherever. Business can be taking place any place. And I think the tough part is when you're actually in that situation.
I want to pause it here because he's acting like only famous people, only celebrities have to mix it up with people, have to network, have to go places, have to go golf to talk business deals and all of that stuff. Like, those are things that you can also do with your friends. And if you're a man and you want to be with your boys, obviously you can fall into those temptations. There's women who are half dressed everywhere, so it's very easy to be tempted, even if you're not a celebrity, right? And so he's saying this as if he's in this special category of where these temptations are only going to happen to people like him.
If you knew what you will find out, you definitely wouldn't do. But to say, hey, you don't have discipline, that's a little triggering given the circumstances that one person has been in versus another person being in.
That's the end of a clip. I don't necessarily agree with that just because someone's not in your situation, they can't judge you. In some situations, that is the case, but in this situation, it's not, because you can literally choose not to sleep with someone no matter how much you want to. That is where the discipline comes in. The discipline is not in not looking at somebody, even though the Bible says not to look at women lustfully, that sort of thing, but you can always still resist the actual act of getting engaged in whatever with a woman. So he is acting like as soon as you set eyes on a woman, the decision is made right there and then. It's not always. You can come to your senses way before anything crazy happens, and if you do, then you should obviously get yourself out of that situation. Then he's also talking about how basically if you knew what would happen, what the outcome would be, maybe you wouldn't do whatever you were about to do. And I don't know if that's always the case, because I think what a lot of people may find interesting is the appeal of not knowing what's going to happen, the thrill of engaging in something exciting and not really knowing the outcome. So I don't know if people knew, hey, you know, I'm going to lose my house, or I'm going to lose whatever 5 years from now if I do this. I think most people in the back of their mind, they do know that and they just don't care. And then they have to deal with the fallout once it is exposed. Now, on the topic of temptation, Cam did bring up this topic of knowing right from wrong, but he doesn't always choose right. And that is the key word, choose. He can make a decision. So in that sense, he does have to take responsibility for the decisions that he made. He can't say, oh, well, you know, it was lust that tempted me and all of this stuff, I'm a victim. You're actually choosing to do this behavior as well. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk about marriage. And to give you a little bit of the setup before we play the clip, basically, Cam is saying that he is fearful of getting a divorce. So he does not want to get a divorce because basically he's going to lose all of his money. And he gives an example of Tyreek Hill, who is married for 17 months but has to pay his ex wife a bunch of money. And so the point is that he does not want to part with any of his money. So he is more afraid of having to pay someone money monthly that he's worked hard for, whatever, but he is not afraid of creating a broken home where eventually he's going to have to pay child support. So you can argue that child support is probably going to be less than paying spousal support, especially if you have to provide for that woman who is now your ex-wife at the level that she is used to. Now you're paying for two houses and you're paying a much higher amount of money per month. And so really what it comes down to is that he values money more than he values having a nuclear family. We can go ahead and play the clip.
Personally, not in the news. Because we done seen tons of stuff in the news. Personally.
I would label myself like the black sheep of the family. Right?
Mm-hmm.
My older brother, my mom had 3 sons. My older brother, he's married, happily married. Beautiful family. Then comes me. My younger brother, happily married. Don't have kids yet. They got 2 dogs. They're like the most theatrical, perfect little situation. I admire that.
Mm-hmm.
Not just my younger brother, but my older brother. And also my father. Real examples, I know what marriage is. I have great examples. But there also was a thing that said, what would Jesus do? Correct?
Who created that?
Man.
Okay, so we ain't.
But we all want to be like Jesus,
yeah,
right?
Okay.
Jesus wasn't married.
Bro, son, come on.
I want to pause it here because this is Cam arguing a few things. So he's setting it up to say that he's a black sheep because his brothers are married and he's not. So he's saying marriage is not for me, and marriage is not for me because I'm a celebrity. I basically like all of the women who are tempting me, that sort of thing, right? So basically he is saying that his lifestyle is not suited for marriage, and that's a choice. You have a choice of what lifestyle you live, and you can change that at any time. He's just not willing to. The other thing that he said is, what would Jesus do? And so he's pointing out the fact that Jesus is not married, and so he's saying, oh, I should be like Jesus. I don't have to be married, right? And so this is where it feels like he's picking parts of the Bible that he wants to follow, parts of the Bible that he wants to ignore, and that is where I kind of see the problem with his messaging, because he is saying that he's not perfect, he's going to make a mistake, but he's using the Bible to negatively back up his action instead of using the Bible to inspire him to change and make better decisions.
How long was Jesus here?
33 years.
How long was his ministry?
A lifetime.
3. Well, when he was, he ministered his entire life, because at 12 he was teaching in a synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
But they say, scholars or theologians say at 30, and then he lived 3 years in accomplishing all that he needed to do. Now, you use him as an example, but throughout, let's go to the beginning. The goal is one man, one woman, one flesh. 2, which is 1 and 1, equals 2, become one flesh. That's scripture. Okay, so real quick.
But I just need to hear this. Was Jesus married or not?
I already answered that.
I didn't hear you.
No, he was not married.
Okay.
Okay.
Keep making your point.
I want to pause it here because this is what he's doing throughout the interview. His body language is weird. He looks kind of bored at times, or he looks like he's pouting, and then he's looking for those gotcha moments that are trying to prove his point, but he's actually, in my opinion, wrong because of how he's approaching them. He's approaching this using the Bible, using scripture, using religion to justify why he can't be a better person, why he can't be a better man because of his lifestyle, and then he's trying to say, oh, well, marriage is not important because Jesus wasn't married. And so this goes back to what Jason was saying about needing to know the Bible, because he goes back to Adam and Eve. They're two people come together as one flesh, all of that stuff. And he's acting like he doesn't understand what that means or what that is about. And so later on, they continue to talk about marriage, and he kind of devalues it because, again, he's scared of divorce and he just sees marriage as a way for women to get money. He doesn't see marriage as a responsibility to provide for a wife and a family and to be a man who is worthy of leading a family. And so, yes, you can still be a good father even if you are having kids out of wedlock or you're not married to the woman that you have kids with. And in his case, he can't be married to all three women, right? This creates the problem because now he is not providing for all of his kids under one roof. So my point is that Cam is not willing to or not wanting to lead a family the right way.
Okay, well, we can stay there. What is your point? Did he preach against marriage? What did Jesus say the reason why Moses allowed for divorce?
Infidelity.
No.
What? The adultery. No, it wasn't adultery?
Remember, the Most High is, see, when you're running or escapism, you think because the Most High allows something that he approved it. Yeshua, Jesus said that Moses allowed them that certificate of divorce because the people's hearts were hardened. It's not his will, son.
So you can just see the look on Cam's face. He's not understanding this and he's just kind of bored over the situation because he's not hearing what he wants to hear. But regarding the story that Jason is talking about, basically this goes back to the idea of why bad things are allowed to happen and why people can get married, why people can get divorced, all of that stuff. And so if this was a perfect world, obviously God would not allow bad things to happen. But because of free will, because people have depraved minds, going back to Romans 1, people are allowed to do things that God wouldn't want them to do. And it's on you to make the right decision to, one, read the Bible and make sure you understand what it says and what lessons are being taught, but then also making the right decisions every day. And it's going to be tough. You are going to make decisions that you don't want to make because it's the right thing to do. And that's always going to be difficult. It's not easy to do the right thing, but you should do it anyway, right? And so that's what Cam is not understanding. He is choosing what's easier. It's easier to give in to temptation. It's easier to not resist the temptation, right? And so that's something that he and other men are going to have to learn if they really want to kind of grow in their development as men and truly become leaders of society and leaders of their families. And the other thing that I found interesting was the comparison to Jesus. So because Jesus wasn't married, that means I don't have to be married. But I also believe that Jesus didn't have kids, at least from what I read. So if I'm wrong on that, correct me. So again, Jesus wasn't married, didn't have kids. You're not married, but you have kids, right? And so obviously you're picking what you follow and then you're just using whatever makes you look good to argue your point without realizing that someone like Jason is going to call you out on it and really hold you to the fire on what it is that you're saying and what your beliefs are about the Bible, about Christianity, and about your role as a man in this world. Alrighty, so to wrap up this video, I did think that this was a good conversation and it definitely revealed a lot about Cam and how he shows up in the world, and that is something for other men to learn from. And Jason kind of spoke to this when he was saying, you know, this is a good conversation. We're both learning from each other, good and bad. And then Cam was like, all good, right? But no, I feel like Jason is learning all of your bad habits and he's learning how to better preach to other men who are in your situation who may be more willing to hear what he has to say. And they always say that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And so I don't really know how the next few years are going to go for Cam. Is he going to grow into a man who can be husband material, who is worthy of being someone's husband? Or is he just going to continue being playboy and kind of moving in and out of relationships and having kids with different women? What does that look like? And also, what message is he teaching to young boys about what it means to be an athlete, to be a celebrity, to have fame, and to also be a man who wants to get married and have a family? How is he going to bridge the gap for men who are going to be in both boats and have to learn how to be famous, successful people who also have families and marriages and be successful at both? Alrighty, so let me know what you think about this interview between Cam Newton and Jason Wilson. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.